right. Hello and welcome, all of you. Thank you for joining us today. Today's program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project, and today our program is going to be the Cold War and the Carter administration. It is being presented to us today by educational specialist Josh Montanari with the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library. All right, the Presidential Primary Sources Project is a collaboration between Internet 2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. It is a free program that we run every year from January to April. All right, this is just a quick reminder that by participating today, you are agreeing to be recorded and archived. We keep recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel so that students and teachers can access them later. Okay, go ahead and share where you're joining us from if you haven't already in the chat. And if you would like, you can be on screen with us. Just let us know in the chat and I will make that happen. If you have any questions or comments today, it's best to put them in the chat and I will see them, or Mr. Josh will see them, and we'll get those questions answered. We really want you to participate. I know you hear me say that every week for those of you that join me regularly, but it's really more fun and interactive and a valuable learning experience when you do participate and ask questions. All right, open up that curious mind today and just type your questions away as Mr. Joss does his presentation. We do ask that you be respectful though and keep your questions to what he is presenting and to our topic being presented today. All right. All right, thank you again for joining us, and we're very happy that you have. This is our website if you're interested in more information about our program, or you are looking for links to our recording or any other information about our program. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that you can have the experience of the Cold War and the Carter administration.
Okay, thank you so much, Robin. Give me one moment while I get my screen shared.
Well, while you're screening, Josh is coming to you from Atlanta. That's you. I'm in Richmond, Virginia. We've got some Maryland people, Texas, New York, Maryland again. Okay.
All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, the topic today is the Cold War and the Carter administration. Now, there are definitely so many avenues that any presidential administration during the Cold War had with that conflict. Obviously, we don't have enough time to go through all of those, but I'll try to cover a couple of the bigger ones with everyone today. And we'll be doing that through primary sources from the Carter Library and the National Archives. So to start off with, there's a nice big Cold War map for us to look at it. I think first thing jumps out to me is that big red blotch on the right side of the screen.
Mr. Josh?
Yes, ma'am?
You need to go into slide mode.
Oh, okay.
And then we don't see the map. We see your opening, Cold War and Carter.
Okay. So it says I'm in slide mode. Let me see. End slide mode.
Well, no, that left it the same.
Huh.
Okay. Well, we can see your slides on the side there.
Okay, one moment. I'm sorry about that. Share. Let's see. Okay, and my screen is going to be
Very.
Okay, should go now, I hope. Did that just change?
It did.
Okay.
But we can see your next slide coming up. And,
I see what you're saying. Oh,
and your points. Sorry, guys, just give us a minute.
Sorry about that.
Well, seeing the notes might actually be good for some of our people that like to read.
Display sync squad presenter view. Okay, how about now?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, very sorry about that hiccup, everybody.
No worries. Okay, I'll leave you alone.
Okay, thank you for pointing that out. The software is always changing, so got to keep up with it. So again, looking at the Cold War map, anything you see that is red or let's see, red and pink would be the Soviet Union and allies. The United States, Western allies would be in that darker blue. Some of their allies will be in the green as well. Something to point out, we'll talk about this later though. You see a couple orange spots, a big one, China. Another one is Yugoslavia, communist nations not aligned with the Soviet Union. So it's often a misperception that all communist nations have strong relationships with each other. That could not be further from the truth when it comes to the Soviet Union and China. And that will definitely come into play in the Carter administration. Oh, sorry, I jumped ahead too many. So just some notable developments in the Cold War. We see some photographs illustrating some of those. Israeli-Arab conflicts begin to magnify Cold War alliances in the Middle East during the 1970s. In 1963, the Cuban Missile Crisis bolstered the United States standing in the Cold War, but it created a lot of tension between China and the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union backed down, China broke off diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union because they thought they should have pressed ahead and they weren't representing the communist world adequately. That leads to tensions that lead to fighting breaking out in 1969 over the Soviet-Chinese border. Limited, but it still happened. But then beginning then in the next decade, the United States and the Soviet Union start to see an easing of Cold War tensions between the Nixon administrations, the Ford administrations. 1972, Richard Nixon is actually welcomed to Beijing, China. And so with détente, a big part of that was the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. And there we see Nixon with Premier Brezhnev. The letter on the left is an example of cooperation that was happening between the United States and Soviet Union, technically still happening today with the space program. That seemed to be a place that we found a lot of cooperation, and we continued cooperation up through today. So there's Nixon when he goes to visit Beijing. And a little bit of levity, we then introduce ping pong diplomacy. Things get going pretty good. Now back to what's happening in the Middle East, because most people don't think of that as the Cold War. We think of Eastern Europe or Southeast Asia, but the Cold War is really happening everywhere, as that map indicated to us. And this is just a very brief summary of the conflicts happening between Israel and their Arab neighbors. Basically, they begin after that document you see on the right side of the screen comes into existence. That is President Harry Truman recognizing the provisional government of Israel in 1948. Essentially, the Arab-Israeli wars start the very next day. The biggest of those, the most impactful, the ones we're seeing still play out on the news today, is the Six-Day War in 1967, a very decisive Israeli victory, mostly thanks to air power, that they come to occupy the Golan Heights of Syria, the West Bank of Jordan, and the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. They have a couple more wars. One in 1970, Israel actually shot down 5 Soviet aircraft that were aiding their Arab allies. It did not turn into something bigger, but it had the potential. And then their final conflict in 1973, Israeli victory, but that leads to the initiation of the Arab oil embargo of the United States. And that would really define the rest of the 70s, and I would say even into the mid 1980s. That triggers the energy crisis. And looking at that, other factors, well, we had our population increase 71% between 1940 and 1980. It's a reason that generation is called the baby boomers. real gross domestic product, meaning all the economic output of our country combined together, that increased over 500%. It sounds like a lot, but when you think about the end of World War II, the United States is really the only international industrial giant standing at that point. All of Europe is in ashes, and China's not industrialized to a great extent yet, nor South America. We're really the only game in town. And fueling all of that, we're taking 1/4 of all the oil exports from the Middle East. And we more or less presume that would always be there and available to us very cheaply. That Arab oil embargo I mentioned, it drove up oil prices 350%, more or less like us waking up to maybe $12, $13 a gallon for gas. That was the reality that folks were facing in the 1970s. And that naturally, there were big runs on it before prices would go up every day. And you saw signs like this in gas stations all over the United States. So during this time, the United States really determines Egypt's the key piece to try to tone everything down. And at this point, Egypt is an ally of the Soviet Union. They're hosting 15,000 Soviet military advisors. They have their economy is basically a communist economy at that time. But we start chiseling away at that. And it's good timing because I think Anwar Sadat, the leader of Egypt, we see on the left side there, I think he sees the writing on the wall with the Soviet Union that this is not going to be the horse that makes it to the finish line, or at least doesn't get there first. In 1972, when the United States signed the SALT agreement with Russia, part of that limited Russia's availability to deliver on weapons promises they made to Egypt. Anwar Sadat uses that as his excuse to kick all of the Russians out of his country and start moving the economy towards a free market system, which is a big kind of wink or nod to the United States. And there we see President Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter's predecessor. I like to say that they're engaging in a nice session of pipe diplomacy, but he and Ford had a great relationship. Gerald Ford is able to use Anwar Sadat's new friendship with the United States to help get the Arab oil embargo against the United States lifted. So that's a start. But again, that's the analog age. Prices just don't change overnight. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So enter Jimmy Carter, running for president, 1976. Different appeals to different voters. On the left, we see Gerald Ford. Somebody put his face on a picture of the Fonz from Happy Days, a show set in the 1950s, so maybe a certain appeal there. On the other hand, we have Jimmy Carter with rock and roll band the Allman Brothers from Macon, Georgia. Maybe a little more hip. They would actually bring him on stage at their concerts with tens of thousands of people, let him introduce himself, get his name out there. So it seems that Carter was a little more facing the younger generations if we just look at some of their campaign materials. Carter does edge out that election, but I'll just say this, and it might sound really weird to some of our younger folks here, but Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, and Gerald Ford, a Republican, became very close friends, remained very good friends for the remainder of their lives. That when Carter was still in office, he and Gerald Ford talked very frequently, and we can confirm that from looking at our Jimmy Carter's daily diary records, which are collections of all of his appointments, who he talks to, where he goes. We see Gerald Ford's name all over those records. So Carter's president now, and he's no different than other presidents. They all have the same constitutional tools to do their job. So when we think of the Cold War, well, there could be congressional legislation possibly subject to approval or veto by the president. The presidents can have executive orders. They do not take the place of a law that's been passed or the Constitution. Usually an executive order is something that is not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, or it's facilitating something that is in the Constitution or is in a law. So for instance, if Congress passes a law that says we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2050, an executive order could be I appoint a person to oversee how we're going to get to that goal, if that makes any sense to anyone. Now, with diplomacy, the president appoints a lot of people. In fact, the president appoints around 5,000 public officers, which includes our representatives to other nations, cabinet secretaries, advisors, people that influence the president's decision. They can have treaties, but the president needs the Senate to approve them. So checks and balances in our government. No single branch gets more power than the others. And with the Senate, we need 2/3. So that's 67 out of 100 senators need to approve any treaty a president makes. And then where presidents differ, that is their previous experience coming to office. Carter's previous experience included being a submarine commander in the Navy, an entrepreneur, a civic leader, a state senator from Georgia, the governor of Georgia, and he was also a human rights advocate. Now, Carter gets most of his people approved for those nominations. On the right, you're seeing what is a tally of votes on Jimmy Carter's nominees. They're pretty divisive today, but we can see back in the late 1970s, if you look all the way on the right-hand column, the ones that have all the votes, it's very big margins. Most people are not objecting to any cabinet officials. Nobody from either party, even presidents of Democrats, there's Republicans in the Senate. Most of them are still going along with the president's appointees. So how can legislation be used to impact diplomatic relations between the U.S. and other nations? Can a law have an impact like a treaty does? Maybe, maybe not. It can contribute. One example, we passed a law in 1947 called the National Security Act. It basically created the National Security Council, which contains the president, vice president, secretary of state, secretary of defense, and other people at the council's discretion. So here's the photograph of President Richard Nixon talking with his secretary of state, Henry Kissinger, during a National Security Council meeting. And presidents continue to use these today. So this could bring, it's almost, I would say, like emergency care to a crisis happening around the world where they really hunker down and try to get solutions to these problems. Defense spending budgets are legislation. So presidents can pass a budget that includes military spending, other initiatives that could address the Cold War. Now, the Nixon and Ford administrations had the Vietnam War drawing down, so naturally defense budgets went down. The Carter administration sought non-nuclear proliferation with the Soviet Union, so a continuation of the SALT negotiations we called Carter's SALT II. There is increased investment in traditional and non-nuclear weapons. Overall, Carter had a 3% budget increase, and that included medium-range missiles positioned in Europe against the Soviet Union in case there were nuclear attacks on our European allies. So there we see an action impacting the Cold War. When we look at this document on the right side of the screen, this comes from the Carter administration at the end, listing their accomplishments in foreign policy. But we can see under cooperation with allies, strengthening of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, more trade negotiations in Europe, completion of Panama Canal treaties, and that's another topic we're going to get into there. So a lot of different ways presidents can address situations through the budget that gets passed by Congress. Now, we mentioned diplomacy was a big tool of Jimmy Carter and his administration. If people want to just jump in the chat, go ahead. Or if you want to get on there and verbalize, if we have that ability, let us know what you think the definition of diplomacy is. So just take a minute there. And this photograph here, we see Jimmy Carter shaking hands with Deng Xiaoping of China when they normalize relations. We'll talk about that as well. But Robin, if you have gotten any responses in the chat, go ahead and say those out loud.
I have not. If you guys could try to answer that, go ahead and type in your answers in the chat. How
Okay.
do you define diplomacy? What do you think diplomacy means?
In your own words, no right or wrong answers here. Just asking what you think it is.
Don't be shy.
There could be some
Okay,
debate happening.
there you go. Okay, Plainview says working with people. Delphin says kindness. I like that, Delphin.
Okay.
Mr. Alger's class thinks it's kind of like democracy. Delphin says good hospitality.
Hmm. Well, that works for a Southern man like Jimmy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think those are all correct answers. Thank you all for providing those. Now we'll see what the government of definition is.
Plainview
Okay.
says negotiating,
Uh-huh.
and another kindness.
Okay.
Hmm. Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah. So I think all of those could factor into the management of a nation's relationships with foreign governments, international organizations, and people of other countries. Those all definitely play a factor. So you're all absolutely correct. Now, any president's foreign policy is then carried out by the Department of State. And we have a little homage here on the left. There, down below is President Harry Truman looking up at our first Secretary of State and third president. Let's see, first Secretary of State, second Vice President, and third President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, who penned our Declaration of Independence, and that's the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C. Now, the Department of State, led by the Secretary of State, you see a picture of Jimmy Carter with one of his Secretaries of State, Cyrus Vance. Main goal is protecting the United States and Americans, advancing democracy, human rights, other interests, promoting an understanding of American values and policies, whatever they may be at the time, and supporting our diplomats and officials in other countries and ones that we have here at home working. Now, Jimmy Carter had two distinct schools of thought in his approach to negotiating with foreign governments. So on the left, we see Cyrus Vance again, Secretary of State. The other gentleman is Zbigniew Brzezinski. I might not have pronounced that completely correct. He was this national security advisor. Now, Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, he really wanted to continue, I guess you could say, the status quo of relations with the Soviet Union that they inherited from Nixon administration and the Ford administration. Basically, to continue cooperating with them, maybe turning a blind eye to some things happening in third world countries, because they really just want to sustain this easing of the tensions. Now, Mr. Brzezinski himself, he emigrated to the United States from Poland, which was a country occupied by the Soviet Union after World War II. So he's got a little bit of experience living under Soviet rule. He believes that they do want to take over spheres of influence all over the world, regardless of what they might be saying. He wants to connect any nuclear arms treaty negotiations with human rights policies around the world, in third world countries. And he advocates for strong responses to any Soviet aggression. So I guess maybe Carter comes down somewhere in the middle here because he has two very different points of view advising him here on foreign policy. Now, Jimmy Carter really reignites human rights as a U.S. policy. We talked about in the past turning a blind eye to human rights infractions in some countries. Well, when he gets into office, it seems he's maybe taking some advice here from Mr. Brzezinski. He's not only is he not overlooking human rights abuses, he's calling them out, the ones happening under our allies' watch, like South Korea. At the time, Iran was still our ally, Argentina, South Africa, Rhodesia. He ended support for the regime in Nicaragua. And he also institutes a congressional requirement for the Department of State to submit a full and complete report on human rights practices around the world every year. There's a document on the right, at one time was confidential, but giving us a little insight into how human rights or factoring into the decisions of the Carter administration. And we see it defined there. The most useful, generally recognized expression is included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's from the United Nations. To maximize effectiveness, our policy should be directed to the most fundamental and important human rights, free from governmental and violations of the integrity of the person, which could be torture, cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment and punishment, arbitrary arrest or imprisonment, denial of a fair public trial, invasion of the home. So just some examples of what that meant for us as a government and our foreign policies.
Josh,
Yes,
I'm sorry to interrupt.
go ahead.
On the last slide there, you mentioned Rhodesia. We have a lot of young attendees, and they're not going to recognize that, I don't think. So while it was called Rhodesia during Carter's administration, it's currently the country of Zimbabwe,
Okay.
which they probably have
Thank,
heard. So I
thank
just
you for
wanted to
bringing that up.
clarify that.
Okay, thank you so much, Robin. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Here's a political cartoon, a different kind of primary source, but illustrating Carter's willingness to bring up human rights with the Soviet Union, despite progress they were making on nuclear treaties. Now, at the time, we were also looking at Central America, the Panama Canal, which opened in the early 20th century, a vital resource for commerce and shipping. So basically, people don't have to sail around South America to get between the East Coast and the West Coast of the Western Hemisphere. Now, in the 60s and 70s, we start seeing some communist insurgency growing. The United States wants to find a way to bolster support for the government. Eventually, there's a coup. Mr. Torrijos, who we see in the picture there, comes to power. And it's with that leader that we aren't able to negotiate a treaty with Panama. Essentially, this will turn over control of the Panama Canal from the United States to Panama over a 20-year period. So it starts 1979. It's fully implemented by 1999. And to this day, the United States reserves the right to intervene with its military if we think Panama's control of that canal is going to be threatened, because it's not just Panama or the United States, it's global commerce that will be impacted if control of that is threatened, if it gets shut down for one reason or another. So we get that accomplished, fending off what we think is another Cold War front there in Central America. Now, a big one, again, pertinent to what's happening today, the Camp David Accords. There we see a sculpture that's in our museum here of the hands of Jimmy Carter, Menachem Begin of Israel, and Anwar Sadat of Egypt when they were shaking hands at the final signing of the Camp David Accords. Now, when you hear the phrase checks and balances in our government, making sure that one branch of the government doesn't have more power than the other, here is one example of how that can play out in a written document. So we mentioned treaties need to be approved by the Senate. Well, Jimmy Carter has a group of 9 senators who are kind enough to give him very clear indications of what they will accept in a treaty, what they will not accept in a treaty. To kind of gloss over that, basically not compromising our military commitments to Israel, making sure that Israel and Egypt normalize their diplomatic relations, meaning that they talk directly with each other, not through other parties, as they were doing at that time, that they would recognize each other's borders, and that they would find a solution to the Israel-Palestinian questions that arose since the 1967 Six-Day War. But largely, we have a whole paragraph on that second page before their signatures that the United States is not going to give them a plan, a timetable, or a map, that this is going to be a peace agreement that comes from Egypt and Israel, that the United States, we're just there to really referee, facilitate things, but not actually create the solution. Now, here is a photograph of the first and last indoor meeting with the three leaders. I believe this is on the second day of Camp David. Uh, Now, if we look at this like some historians, looking at Jimmy Carter, it's a little bit of a smile. Mr. Sadat on the right, I think, I don't know, maybe looks a little bewildered. Feel free to throw in the chat any other descriptors that you might think of. We look at Menachem Begin, looks like he may be in the middle of speaking, really scrunching his brow there, his face. Looks like there's a bit of contention there. In fact, President Carter would go on to reveal that once they got in there, they basically forgot he was in the room. They raised voices. All the pleasantries that they had experienced up to that point were just out the window. So Carter makes a decision at that point that this will not occur anymore, that they will meet separately or with delegations of each country, not the two leaders themselves in the same room. And what they are debating, basically, ultimately for 13 days, is the language of this United Nations resolution. And it's that part that's circled on the screen. I have it bigger on the left side of our screen there. The United Nations determined that Israel needs to withdraw armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict, meaning the 1967 Six-Day War. Now, Israel looked at this sentence basically like a team of lawyers. And if there's anybody out there who thinks they want to get into law, these are things that you'll have to do. Really dissect and more or less overanalyze language. So looking at that sentence, it seems straightforward. But the argument was, it just says withdrawal of Israel armed forces from blank territories occupied in the recent conflict. It doesn't give a number. It doesn't say all territories. Israel looked at that as, we'll consider one. It could be more, but it doesn't mandate us to consider any more than one. There is no descriptor. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead, Robin.
I'm sorry, you went out for a minute. Was
That's
that me or you?
I'm sorry?
I don't know if that was you or me. Sorry about that.
That's okay. So this is what they've really come to argue about, why they can't come to an agreement for nearly 2 weeks. And that should just tell you the gravity of this. Most presidents, they kind of zip around all over the world every few hours. We had a president in one place, well, technically 3 world leaders in one place for almost 2 weeks on this one issue. Eventually, it gets to a point where Sadat threatens to leave. Carter has to intervene. He's described this as the most uncomfortable conversation of his life. More or less, President Carter, in fact, I was able to ask him this question when I was in an audience with him once. He said he had to go threaten his very good friend, that this was someone, not just another world leader, but someone who was a genuine friend of his. And he would have to tell them that the relationships between their countries would suffer, that if he left, he and Egypt would be solely blamed for the failure of these peace talks, and that likely their friendship would be off the table. And that convinces Anwar Sadat to stay. And notably, that's not something the Constitution can tell a president how to do. That's one of those comes from the president's previous experiences. So Jimmy Carter seems to be the right person for the right time here. So we'll just fast forward to the very last day. Now, I mentioned the president's daily diaries. You're seeing one page of those in the center of the screen. Most entries are 2 pages long. Day 13 of the Camp David Summit was 4 pages long. And by the way, you can access these for just about every day of the administration on the Jimmy Carter Library website under its research tab. Now, when we look at, if we had all 4 pages of that here, well, basically, from the point of 7:17 in the morning where we see the president talk with, that's really what the rest of the 3 pages turn into. The president talk with. He's zipping all around Camp David here, talking to all different people, taking phone calls, in-person meetings. And I remember looking at this thinking in my mind, is Jimmy Carter, sprinting back and forth, running all over the place? Turns out he's doing it on a bike. And we see a photograph confirming that on the right there. It's hard to tell what the breakthrough is, how we get to a tentative agreement on the last day. Um, we can look at the daily diaries, we can look at memorandums, we can look at photographs, um, but it's really hard to tell. We really don't know unless we hear directly from the sources. And there are multiple video sources of what the breakthrough was at Camp David. Now, this is one from some years later in 2014. President Carter is speaking at the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library at their Civil Rights Summit. So I'll go ahead and just play this short clip of Jimmy Carter telling us what it was that got that peace agreement to the finish line.
The last day was a turning point because we thought we had failed. And we were getting ready to leave Camp David in failure and go back to Washington and announce that we had not been successful. And Prime Minister Begin asked me if I would sign a photograph for his 8 grandchildren of me and Begin and Sadat. And I agreed to do it. And my secretary, whose name was Susan Clow, got the names of Begin's 8 grandchildren from Israel. She called over there and got their names. So instead of saying best wishes, Jimmy Carter, I said with love and best wishes to, and I put down his grandchild's name and I signed it. And I took it over to his cabin to tell him goodbye. And when he opened the door, he was very angry with me. And he said, "Good afternoon, Mr. President." He was always very proper. And I said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Prime Minister, and I'm sorry we hadn't been successful. I brought the photographs you asked for, and I gave the photographs to him." And he turned around and said, "Thank you, sir." And then he looked down at the photographs, and he read out loud, "Love and best wishes to," and he read his grandchild's name. And he put that over in the back, and he read the next one's name. And he read the third one's name, and his chin began to quiver, and tears ran down his cheeks, and mine too. And he said, in effect, "Why don't we try one more time?"
Mm-hmm.
So again, we have another instance of something the Constitution, can't teach you what to do. A president relying on their previous experiences, their own personal character. And Menachem Begin has, confirmed that is what made me trust Jimmy Carter, because for most of those negotiations, he felt it was the U.S. and Egypt against Israel, because technically Israel was the one holding all the cards. But that was what sealed the relationship between Jimmy Carter and Menachem Begin, that convinced him that Carter was sincere about his desires for peace. Okay, let me just get that.
The last day.
Sorry about that. So the impact of those, pretty big on the Cold War, and normalized relations between Egypt and Israel. Return of the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt that Israel had occupied, which also included withdrawing Israeli forces from those lands. The Suez Canal, kind of like the Panama Canal in the Middle East, that had been closed to Israeli ships. It was now open to Israeli ships. And it provided a framework for peace between Israel and Palestinians. But something that almost never happened in the Cold War, we took someone, Egypt, who was in the Soviet Union's camp, and we turned them into a Western ally. That was not an easy thing to do during the Cold War, but Carter does pull that off. And again, as we saw before, it was continuing work of previous administrations. That work begins with the Nixon administration, continued with Ford, finished with Carter. Now, diplomatic relations with China, the other communist elephant in the room. There we see a reception after those happened. Again, President Nixon, despite resigning office under threat of impeachment, apparently he's welcome back to the White House. And we see leaders from China on the right-hand side there. Now, basically, these were folks who had been allies of us in the Second World War, turned into foes after the conclusion of that conflict. On the left, we see an image from the Second World War where we have the leaders of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, the United States, Stalin of Russia, and Chiang Kai-shek of the Republic of China. Now, on the right, we see the leader of the Communist Revolution of China, Mao Zedong. So that revolution comes to a pitch in 1955. The communist forces, known as the People's Republic of China, defeat the Republic of China. They withdraw to Taiwan, an island off the coast of China, where they remain today. The United States and China fight proxy wars, meaning they were helping other people in other countries in conflict who shared their ideology. So we have that in Korea and Vietnam, where North Korea and North Vietnam align with China, receiving military support. South Korea and South Vietnam receiving United States support. The United States only recognized the Republic of China, the ones that had to flee to Taiwan, for 30 years. We more or less pretended that the new communist government of China, governing coming up on 1 billion people at the time, we're pretending they don't exist. They're invisible to us. Now, we talked a little bit about the Chinese-Soviet relationship. Again, not all communist countries are allies. China and Russia were more or less competing to be the symbolic leader of the communist world, to have their brand of communism be the norm. So when China becomes communist, we have what calls a bipolar Cold War, which means between two, Russia and the United States. It turns into tripolar with 3 countries. Now, I mentioned before, the People's Republic of China had broken off relations with the Soviet Union. They see the SALT agreements, the strategic arm limitation, the minimizing of nuclear weapons with the United States and Russia, as a threat, because they're just starting to get their nuclear program off the ground. And they want to get it they want to get it to a level that it's taken seriously by the United States and the Soviet Union. China and the Soviet Union are also both trying to court India at that time. And that's further eroding the Chinese-Soviet relationship. So Carter's got a really tough balancing act to do, because the United States does want to normalize relationship with China. China at this time is becoming increasingly industrialized. It's joining the global economy. It's having impacts around the world. So we've more or less realized we can't ignore them and pretend they're not there anymore. But at the same time, we still want to maintain the détente, that easing of tension with the Soviet Union. And we want to address human rights, which both of these countries are flagrantly violating at this point in history. So it is not an easy task ahead of Carter. All these things building for the last 20, 30 years are kind of all coming to a head right when he's in office. Now, Nixon had started what was called the Shanghai Communique. Now, in the absence of formal diplomatic relations, this was like a back channel for the United States and China. So unofficial communications, because when you don't have diplomatic relations, you have to go through intermediaries or a third party, another country that may be friendly with that country that you're not. And so there's always, there's not direct communication. So this is what Nixon is trying to slowly implement during his administration. They had respective offices in each of their capitals, kind of like an embassy, but they weren't calling it that. Taiwan, which was the Republic of China, the ones that were driven off the mainland, they still have their embassy in Washington. So technically, we're still recognizing them as the Chinese government. But we start to slowly move back our military personnel in Taiwan, and we start talking with them a little bit less, talking with China more. Ford continues these efforts of the Nixon administration when he comes into office, but then we kind of have a thing hit them out of left field with the collapse of South Vietnam. At the time, there had been a delicate peace in place between North Vietnam, South Vietnam. The communists then overtake the South, more or less effectively ending the Vietnam War. So again, with that Cold War Balancing Act, and there Carter is again with Deng Xiaoping, come up with this statement that they think satisfies both the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, that there is but one China. and Taiwan is part of China. It's a simple statement, but diplomatically kind of genius when you think about it, because technically either the folks in Taiwan or the Chinese government on the mainland can use that statement. Um, so, and that's still being used between the countries today. So we do have a Taiwan Relations Act because we do want to maintain cultural, commercial, other relations with Taiwan amidst our increasing engagement with the communist government. And so Carter does formalize this January 1st, 79, New Year's Day. And I had heard President Carter say in person that this was the most significant accomplishment of his administration. And when we think about it, it's not just we're talking to avoid wars, it's also trade, cultural exchanges, technological exchanges, scientific exchanges, educational exchanges. A lot is involved when two countries officially have relations. Now, the impact on the Soviet relations, well, it definitely increased tensions. The Soviet Union thought that things were going one way. Carter more or less blindsided them with that official recognition of the communist government in China. And a lot of historians agree that this decision nudges the Soviet Union into their decision to invade Afghanistan in December of 1979. A lot of folks thought this could have been the start of World War III. In fact, Jimmy Carter asked Congress to consider revising the Selective Service Act, or the draft, so that it would include women and not just men in the case that a wider conflict broke out. Luckily, it did not. The United States began their support of the Mujahideen. They were the people in Afghanistan fighting the Soviet occupation. Before Congress, Carter declared that any Soviet incursion in the Persian Gulf region, which is essentially what the Soviet Union is trying to do in Afghanistan, that it will be an assault on the vital interests of the United States. And tensions even play out in the Winter Olympics in 1980. There we see a painting of the famous Miracle Game on Ice, as it came to be known, when the United States team of college players defeated the Soviet Union team of professional players, more or less the NHL All-Stars is basically what the Soviet hockey team was. Now, we played out the Winter Olympics after that invasion of Afghanistan, but Carter then boycotts the Summer Olympics. Back then, we had them in the same year. It wasn't split apart by 2 years. Winter and summer were both the same year. So more or less, a lot of Western allies also boycott the Summer Olympics. Actually, the Soviet Union was scheduled to host the Summer Olympics in '84. The United States was hosting the Summer Olympics in '84. The Soviet Union and many of the countries they had influence over boycott that. And it doesn't seem like too big a deal, but this actually, I can tell you, there's some folks in the Olympic Committee still bitter about this because, maybe rightfully so, because they believe the whole purpose of the Olympics is for countries to rise above politics, disagreements, conflicts, to come together in athletic competitions. And they felt that President Carter, more or less pulled the rug out from the foundation of the Olympic Games. So a lot of folks definitely weren't happy about that when it happened. Plus, when you think of athletes, they train all their lives. Some of them only had that one window, depending on the sport, and they lost that window. Now, coming back to the nuclear treaties, we do sign a treaty with the Soviet Union to continue reducing our nuclear arms. It's not officially implemented. Again, because of the Soviet Union of Afghanistan, they don't want to publicly admit they're cooperating with us, and us, same thing. We don't want to admit that we're cooperating with them. But more or less, we do implement this behind the scenes. So we are still reducing nuclear arms. So to conclude our discussion, just general questions, no right or wrong answers. And this was just some of the things that with the Carter administration in the Cold War. How did Carter's actions impact our relations with the Soviet Union? Do we think that they brought about the end of the Cold War, or did they prolong it with that increasing of tension? So go ahead and I'm gonna stop.
Okay, we have a question, Josh.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm gonna come back on video. You are off video, by the way. Stephen Gilroy's class wants to know if didn't Carter kiss Brezhnev on both cheeks, which greatly surprised him?
I believe so when they met in person. That was a Russian greeting, and I think for diplomacy's sake, that's why Carter did that.
Okay, that's a good question.
That is a great question. I mean, that was a little bit of a scandal at the time. Good question.
Earlier, okay, I hope you don't mind. I answered this in the chat,
No,
but
go ahead.
earlier, I just will tell you that's here. The Stephen Gilroy also mentioned that they thought that the revolution in China occurred in 49.
Begins in 1949. It's formally over in 1955. That was the date I had listed. That was when the existing government of China was officially off the mainland, retreated to Taiwan, and the communist hold on power was solidified.
So I told him that actually the two sides were fighting throughout the 30s because they were, and that they put aside differences to fight Japan during the war.
Yeah, as well. Yeah, there was fighting beforehand. The revolution didn't happen overnight. I guess it really comes to a fever pitch between 49 and 55.
Okay.
That's a great question.
Yep. Okay, guys, what kind of question do we have? That's a lot of information, a lot of good information presented today. I relived my childhood because I was a child in the 70s under Carter's administration. So a lot of that is my childhood. What kind of questions do you guys have?
Right. Do we think Jimmy Carter made good decisions for our country? I mean, there's no right or wrong answers. If you have other questions or if you want to chime in with your thoughts on the overall impact, I mean, you might need a little bit of prior knowledge. If you don't know how the war in Afghanistan went, more or less the Soviet Union is bankrupt from that war, which lasted close to a decade by the time they withdraw in the late 80s. And many historians attribute that the financial cost of that war is bringing about the collapse of the Soviet Union. But that's up for debate. We look at the primary sources and we decide for ourselves what happened. Let's see, did the Chinese refuse to attend the White House ceremony unless Nixon was invited? I don't know the answer to that, but I would imagine, I wouldn't doubt that they could have said that because Nixon is the one that first more or less broke bread with the Chinese government, the first American administration after the communists took over to engage with them. So I could believe it if someone told me that. I don't know that for sure, though. And it should be worth noting, we saw that photograph of them, all having a good time at that ball. Deng Xiaoping, he looked kind of harmless, a really short gentleman that was in that photograph. That's an example of, sometimes when you take on the office of the presidency, you inherit relationships you may or may not like. And Mr. Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese gentleman there, he's the person who orders the massacre on Tiananmen Square about a decade after they're there meeting in Washington, where countless Chinese youth were killed while protesting for their rights, for democracy in their country.
How about Carter attending? Did he attend Sadat's funeral?
I believe he did attend Sadat's funeral. Sadat pays the ultimate price for that peace agreement. While the country approves it, a lot of folks aren't too happy with it. Plus, Sadat was, I would say, maybe being a little harsh, rooting out some dissidents in his country at the time. So I think those circumstances combined led to his assassination. He was observing a military parade, and that was the cover for the assassin. Some of them broke out of the parade and came up to the stands and opened fire on him.
That was terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we were all surprised by that, if I remember correctly. I was a teenager, and we were all like, "What?"
I was messing my diapers at the time. So I didn't quite know.
No, no worries. But I remember the general atmosphere, though. We were all like really proud at that moment to be Americans when he brokered the peace treaty.
Right. I mean, I wouldn't even categorize it as a Jimmy Carter accomplishment. It's just an American accomplishment. Again, this was something that had been, in fact, the Panama Canal Treaty talks, those start in the 60s. When we first start seeing, some communist activity happening there. I mean, it's almost like a 20-year buildup getting to that point, because it starts in the Kennedy administration when we start, thinking about this. Maybe we need to turn it over to Panama, then the government has more credibility with its people, which is
Right.
ultimately what does happen in Panama. People now
So
see like Panama operates the Panama Canal. Um,
speaking
so
of Panama, we have a question here. If the Carter Center has a statement about the Panama Canal
I
currency
haven't seen any
situation.
statements issued. So just to clarify, I work at the Carter Presidential Library. We're a unit of the National Archives and Records Administration. So we're part of the federal government. We do share a campus with the nonprofit Carter Center, an organization that President and Mrs. Carter established in 1982. They work in more than 80 countries around the world. I do not know if they have issued a statement on that. My recommendation, if you go to their webpage, cartercenter.org, one of the tabs I think shows all the countries that they work in. If Panama's among it, it could be mentioned there. They do have their uh, press releases there as well. You can also access newsletters that they send out. So you might be able to find the answer to that there. It's really good questions. You guys are really sharp questions here today.
Yeah. All right. If you got another question, we're gonna we'd like to wrap it up in a few minutes. Delton says, thank you for the presentation.
So
Delton, it
very
was
well.
nice seeing you here.
Thanks for joining.
Um, oh, here's another one.
And
Did President Carter have the support of former presidents in his dealings? That's a good
Absolutely,
question.
absolutely, he did. Again, it's going to sound strange to young people out there today. Um,
Yeah,
the parties weren't completely polar, I guess, polar different from each other. Um,
right.
and thinking of the Democratic Party, you just look at the Kennedy administration. You have liberal John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts, with a vice president he chose, conservative, had been a segregationist, Lyndon Johnson from Texas. So very different dynamics back then. But much of what's happening in Jimmy Carter's administration, I would say from Kennedy forward, were things that he was bringing closure to or continuing. In particular, the Nixon and Ford administrations, again, Republican administrations, he's a Democrat. So many things uh, impacted his administration. And we think of the Equal Rights Amendment. That's something completely, well, not totally different from this topic. That was an amendment he put out in 1972, attempted to ratify, that would declare the sexes were equal. That was something supported by Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, and Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Again, both political parties there. So he had a lot of support. And as I mentioned with Gerald Ford, we see Gerald Ford's name all the time
Mhm.
in those daily diary entries of Jimmy Carter's, with calls back and forth to them and meetings that happened with them. So there was definitely I'd say, much higher level of cooperation between the political parties in President Carter's time than we see today.
I think I would agree with that.
Mhm. And
And I
I
love
mean,
the friendship that developed between Clinton and the elder Bush too. I
yes,
mean, it would be
even they
nice
have
to
good
see that.
relationships. Um, yeah. Oh God, I just had a thought and it went out of my head.
Oh, that's okay.
But if
We've
About Ford. Oh, it was Ford and Carter. Yeah, I think a big part of their bond when they were both Navy veterans.
Mm.
And Carter said they really bonded though when they were talking in a meeting about the challenges of raising money to establish their presidential libraries, and that they just stayed in close communication after that. And not just they were friends. Rosalind Carter and Betty Ford were very good friends with each other. In
Mhm.
fact, they campaigned together for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment during Jimmy Carter's time in office. Carter also, again, very, I would say, a fiscal conservative president, even to a certain extent, socially conservative um, at that time. It's Jimmy Carter that um, gets Congress to pass, and he signs a lot of industrial deregulation, something we typically would see coming from conservative politicians. But Jimmy Carter deregulates the airline industry, the railroad industry. Um, and I think Ronald Reagan was more than happy to take the credit for it when it was implemented in his administration. But it's a Democrat that did that. So it's a different time. And the parties definitely had different platforms, I would say, than they do today, unfortunately.
Well, Josh, we've come to the end of our time here, the 12:01. I'm going to go ahead and say, everyone, thank you. You still have an audience here. Thank you for attending today's session. We really appreciate your participation and your thoughtful questions today. Josh, thank you for your time and really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much.